My parents called me a cash cow and said, she's too stupid to realize that she's just a wallet for us. And then they sued me. Hi everyone. Before I jump into this story, I need your help. The channel is struggling with views, and most people don't watch until the end. If you enjoy these kinds of stories, please subscribe, like, and turn on notifications. It really helps keep the content going. Now let's get into it. Hi Reddit. I don't even know where to start. I guess I always believed that family was the most important thing in life. I grew up in an average middle-class home, nothing fancy, just a small 3-bedroom house in Ohio. My parents, Karen and Tom, were constantly struggling with money, or at least, that's what they always said. My older sister Emily, now 32, loved expensive things but never wanted to work for them. And my younger brother Justin, 26, is a full-time gamer who thinks a job is just a wage cage for suckers. I, on the other hand, took a different path. I started my own online business selling handmade accessories while I was still in college. I worked my ass off, pulling all-nighters to get my brand off the ground. It wasn't an overnight success, but after years of dedication, I was finally making enough money to live comfortably. Looking back, I realize I unknowingly stepped into the role of my family's financial safety net. It started small, covering house repairs, buying birthday gifts for my parents when my siblings forgot, helping out with groceries when my mom said she was short on cash. But soon, it escalated. Emily racked up thousands in credit card debt and somehow convinced me to help pay it off, just this once. Justin quit his job at a local store because he wanted to focus on streaming full-time and suddenly needed money for rent. And I, like an idiot, paid. Every single time. I kept telling myself, this is just temporary. That one day, Emily would get a job, or Justin would finally start making money from his gaming. I justified it by thinking, well, they're my family. Families help each other, right? It all came crashing down 2 months ago when I found out exactly how my family really saw me. It started when my dad called me in a panic. He said the house needed urgent repairs, something about the plumbing being completely shot, and they couldn't afford it. He made it sound like the house was going to flood if I didn't step in. I sighed and wired over $8,000. Not a thank you, not a single word of appreciation. Just, got it. Then, a week later, Emily called, crying. Her car had broken down, and she didn't have the money to fix it. She said she needed $3,000 immediately, or she'd lose everything. Against my better judgment, I sent it. Again, not even a thanks. Then came the breaking point. I went to visit my parents for dinner, and while we were eating, my mom casually mentioned that she and dad were thinking about downsizing now that Emily and Justin were adults. I didn't think much of it until my dad let it slip that they were actually moving into a much bigger house, a 5-bedroom, 2-story home in a gated community. I nearly choked on my food. Wait, how? You guys are always struggling with money. That's when my mom, without an ounce of shame, looked me dead in the eye and said, oh, honey, we used the money you sent us for the house repairs as a down payment. I just stared at her. You what? My dad waved a hand dismissively. Relax, Lauren, it's an investment. The old house was falling apart. This new place will be worth more in a few years. It's a smart move. I was in shock. You lied to me. You said the plumbing was a disaster. You made it sound like the house was going to collapse. Emily, who had been quiet up until now, snorted. God, you're so dramatic. It's not like you need the money. You're doing fine. Justin, of course, chimed in with his usual nonsense. Yeah, you're like rich. What's the big deal? That's when I realized these people didn't see me as family. They saw me as a bank. A never-ending ATM that would just keep handing out money, no questions asked. I pushed back my chair and stood up. I'm done. My mom frowned. Done with what? Done with all of you. The money, the handouts, the lies. All of it. They actually laughed. Emily rolled her eyes. Oh please, you always say that. You're too soft to actually cut us off. Something inside me snapped. I pulled out my phone, opened my banking app, and started removing them from everything. The shared family account I'd been contributing to? Gone. The automatic payments I'd set up for my mom's utilities? Cancelled. The monthly help I'd been sending Justin? Stopped. Lauren, what are you doing? My mom asked, her voice finally showing some concern. I looked up. You'll figure it out. You always do, right? And then I left. It's been 2 months since I cut them off. The first few weeks were interesting. My parents tried calling nonstop, leaving voicemail after voicemail, switching between guilt-tripping. We're your parents. You have a responsibility. And anger. You ungrateful brat. After everything we've done for you. Emily sent me furious texts about how I was ruining her life because she couldn't afford her car payment anymore. Justin tried the, I'm your little brother, don't you care about me, angle. I ignored them all. Then, last week, I got the final blow. My mom called, sounding tired and defeated. Lauren, please. We're going to lose the new house. We overestimated what we could afford. We need your help. I took a deep breath and said, no, but we're your family. Funny, I said. I don't remember family treating each other like ATMs. Then I hung up. Now I'm sitting here, wondering, was I too harsh? Should I have given them another chance? Or was this the wake-up call they needed? Nick was the first person to notice the shift in my mood. At first, I didn't even realize it myself. It wasn't like there was some huge dramatic event. No single moment where everything clicked. It was more like a slow drip, little things piling up until I was drowning, and I hadn't even noticed. It started with the family dinners. Back when I first started making money, I liked treating my family. It felt good to be able to pick up the check, to take my parents and siblings out for a nice meal without worrying about the cost. But somewhere along the way, it stopped being a treat and became an expectation. One evening, we were all at a steakhouse, one of my dad's favorites. Everyone ordered whatever they wanted, appetizers, drinks, the most expensive entrees on the menu. When the check arrived, my dad just pushed it toward me without even looking up from his phone. I hesitated, waiting for someone, anyone, to at least make a token offer to split it. Nothing. Nick, who had tagged along that night, must have noticed my expression because later, as we were driving home, he brought it up. Do they ever pay? He asked, keeping his eyes on the road. I let out a small laugh, trying to brush it off. They're not in the best financial situation. He glanced at me. Yeah, but, I mean, it's not like you're a millionaire. They don't even offer. I shrugged. It's just easier this way. He didn't push, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. Then there were the jokes. My brother, Justin, had always been lazy, but lately, he wasn't even pretending to be interested in working. One afternoon, I was over at my parents' house when he came downstairs in his usual uniform, sweatpants, and an old hoodie. He plopped onto the couch, picked up his controller, and without looking away from the screen, said, "Man, I don't know what I'd do without you. You're, like, my financial plan for the future." I blinked. What? He laughed. Come on, it's a joke. Obviously. Except it wasn't. He said it so casually, like it was just a given that I'd always be there to bail him out, that his future wasn't something he had to worry about because I'd handle it. I forced out a chuckle, but something about it stuck with me. A few days later, I was having coffee with my mom when I mentioned that I was trying to save up for a down payment on an apartment. She sighed dramatically, stirring her tea. Must be nice, she said. I frowned. What do you mean? She gave me a tired smile. Oh, nothing. Just, your father and I could use a little help too. You're always saving for something, but what about us? I felt a familiar pang of guilt. Mom, I've helped with a lot. I just sent you money for the house repairs last month. She waved a hand. Oh, I know, honey, and we appreciate it. But it's just hard, Things are tight, and sometimes I think about how nice it would be if you could, help a little more. A little more. Nick noticed how quiet I was when I got home that night. You okay? He asked, sitting down beside me on the couch. Yeah, I said automatically. He didn't buy it. Lauren, I sighed, rubbing my temples. It's just my mom. She made this comment about how I should be helping them more. And Justin made this joke about me being his financial plan. And I don't know, maybe I'm overthinking it, but it just feels like they're using you. Nick finished. I hesitated. I wouldn't say that. He tilted his head. But it feels that way, doesn't it? I didn't answer. Then, a week later, Emily took it to a whole new level. We were at her apartment, and she was flipping through a magazine, barely paying attention to the conversation. She said, not looking up. You should probably put me in your will. I nearly choked on my drink. What? She smirked. I mean, let's be real. You're the responsible one, the one with actual money. If anything happens to you, it just makes sense that I'd get something, right? I stared at her, waiting for her to laugh, to tell me she was kidding. She didn't. I set my glass down. Emily, I'm 29. I don't even have a will. She shrugged. Well, you should, and I should be in it. I was speechless. That night, Nick found me sitting at the kitchen table, just staring at my laptop, my untouched dinner sitting beside me. Lauren, he said, pulling out a chair. Talk to me. I sighed. I think you're right. About what? My family. I exhaled slowly. They don't just expect me to help. They think it's my job. Like I owe it to them. Nick didn't say anything for a moment. Then, softly, he asked, and what do you think? I swallowed hard. I think I don't know how to say no. It was pure chance that I came home early that night. Nick and I had planned to grab dinner after work, but he got called into a last-minute meeting, so I decided to just head home instead. The house was dark except for the warm glow of the living room lights spilling into the hallway. I was about to call out to let my parents know I was home when I heard them talking. Something about the tone of their voices made me pause. They weren't just chatting. They were laughing, really laughing. And then I heard my name. I should have walked in. I should have made my presence known. But something told me to wait, to listen. She's too stupid to realize she's just being used, Emily said, still giggling. I froze. Oh, I know, my mother chimed in, sounding amused. She just hands over the money without a second thought. It's almost too easy. Speaking of which, Emily continued, remember how I told her I needed that money for my car repairs? Yeah, that actually went to my Miami trip. I felt my stomach drop. My hands curled into fists at my sides. My dad let out a low chuckle. Unbelievable. And she didn't even question it. Of course not, Emily said smugly. She's always been like this. So desperate for approval, for love. It's pathetic. Pathetic. There was a clinking of glasses, as if they were toasting to their little con job. And then my mother spoke again, her voice taking on that soft, almost affectionate tone she used whenever she wanted something. The main thing, she said, is that she never realizes anything. She will continue to pay us because she thinks we love her. For a second, I couldn't breathe. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. My ears were ringing, my vision blurred, but one thought cut through the fog, sharp and cold. They don't love me. They love my wallet. I wanted to burst into the room, to scream, to throw every single word they had just said back in their faces. But instead, I just stood there, silent and shaking. All these years, all the money, all the sacrifices. And for what? For this? I turned and walked out of the house as quietly as I had entered, my mind racing, my heart pounding. The laughter still echoed behind me, but it didn't matter. Nothing mattered anymore. I wasn't their daughter. I was their paycheck. And I was done. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The betrayal still burned, but instead of letting my anger take over, I decided to be smart about this. I wasn't going to storm into the house, screaming about how I had overheard everything. No, I wanted proof, something undeniable, something they couldn't twist into me being too sensitive or misunderstanding things. I wanted them to show me exactly who they were. So I played along. That Sunday, I showed up to family dinner like I always did, forcing a smile as I sat at the table. My mother had made her usual roast, the one she always bragged about but overcooked every single time. Emily was scrolling through her phone, barely acknowledging my presence, while Justin was shoveling food into his mouth like he hadn't eaten in days. My father was nursing a beer, eyes flicking between his plate and the football game playing on the muted television. I waited until we were halfway through the meal before casually mentioning, business has been a little slow lately. Things aren't looking great. I wasn't sure what I expected. Maybe a flicker of concern, a question about how I was holding up, anything resembling basic human empathy. Instead, my mother immediately set down her fork and frowned. Well, you'll still help with the bills, right? Not, are you okay? Not, do you need anything? Just immediate worry about whether my money would keep flowing. Emily didn't even look up from her phone. Ugh, you better not cut me off. I have expenses, you know. Justin, still chewing, shrugged. Yeah, speaking of which, have you put me on your health insurance yet? I keep meaning to do it, but, you know, too much of a hassle. I stared at him. You have to be an employee of my business to be on my insurance. He smirked. So hire me. I don't actually want to work, but it'd be nice to have coverage. My dad, laughing, took a sip of his beer and leaned back in his chair. If something happens to you, we'll just sell your business. Gotta live on something, right? I felt something inside me snap. Not in an explosive way. Not in a dramatic, table-flipping kind of way. It was quieter than that. A cold, final realization settling into my bones. They didn't see me as a daughter. They didn't even see me as a person. I was nothing more than a financial asset to them, a resource to be used up and discarded when I was no longer useful. I smiled, an automatic, empty reflex. Of course, I said lightly, taking a sip of my wine. I'd never let the family struggle. And just like that, they all went back to their food, reassured that their walking ATM was still operational. That was the moment I knew. I was done playing their game. But first, I was going to make sure they regretted every single dollar they ever took from me. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation, every moment that had led to this. The years of being used, of being treated like a walking bank account instead of a daughter. I had finally seen them for what they were. And now, I was going to make sure they felt it. But I wasn't stupid. I knew that if I cut them off too suddenly, they'd come after me like vultures. They'd guilt trip, scream, manipulate, anything to keep the money flowing. So I needed a plan. A slow, calculated withdrawal. The first step was Emily. A week after the family dinner, she texted me, as she often did, with a casual, "Hey, can you send me that money for my car payment?" I took a deep breath and typed back, "Ugh, annoying bank issues. They froze my account for some reason. I'll call them tomorrow and figure it out." She responded within seconds. What? What do you mean froze? Some fraud alert thing, I guess. I'll fix it in a few days. There was a long pause before she sent, Ugh, fine. Just hurry up. Step 1, delay. Step 2, Justin. I had given him a prepaid card to cover his rent and utilities, mostly because I was tired of him calling me every month about forgetting to pay. Now, it was time to take that away. I called him, putting on my best stressed businesswoman voice. Hey, so my accountant flagged some weird activity on the cards I gave you. I think someone tried to use one in another state, so they temporarily blocked them. Just a security thing, but I have to go through a whole verification process before I can reactivate them. Silence. Then, wait, so I can't use the card. Not for now. Hopefully, it'll be sorted out soon. Well, can't you just send me money another way? I sighed dramatically. I wish, but with everything locked up, it's a mess. I'll let you know when it's fixed. He muttered something under his breath, but I didn't ask him to repeat it. I could already imagine the annoyed look on his face, the way he'd throw himself back into his gaming chair and sulk. Step 3, my parents. This was the trickiest one. Unlike my siblings, my parents felt entitled to my money. I had to be careful, make it seem like I wasn't cutting them off, just redirecting my funds elsewhere. I called my mom in the evening, knowing she was usually in a good mood after dinner. Hey, Mom, I wanted to give you a heads up. I need to invest more into the business right now, so I have to put a pause on covering the house bills for a bit. It's just temporary, but I need to be smart about my finances. There was a brief silence before she said, Oh, well, how temporary? A couple of months, probably. A couple of months? She repeated, her voice tightening. Yeah, just until I get things stabilized. You know how it is. She exhaled sharply. Lauren, you know we rely on you. Your father and I, well, we don't have the kind of income to cover everything. I don't know how we'll manage. I closed my eyes, forcing a sympathetic tone. I know, Mom. It's just a rough patch. I wish I could do more right now, but I have to make sure the business survives first. I promise, as soon as things settle, I'll step back in. She was quiet for a long time. Then, in a softer, almost fragile voice, she said, I just don't understand after everything we've done for you. There it was. The first attempt at guilt tripping. I played along. I know, and I appreciate it. That's why I'm doing everything I can to make sure I can keep helping in the future. Just hold tight, okay? She sighed again. Okay, sweetheart. I trust you. But she didn't. I could feel it. And sure enough, the fallout began almost immediately. The next day, Emily called, her voice sharp. Have you fixed your bank issue yet? Still working on it. I lied. Lauren, I need that money. I could practically hear her pacing. I'll get it to you as soon as I can, I said, feigning exasperation. It's out of my hands right now. She hung up on me. Then came Justin, sending me a barrage of texts. This is ridiculous. How do you not have access to your own money? You're just being lazy. You know I need that card. I ignored him. By the weekend, my mother was calling daily. At first, it was concern. Are you sure everything is okay with the business? Then it shifted to frustration. I just don't understand why you're not prioritizing your family. And finally, it turned into full-blown accusations. You're being selfish, Lauren. We raised you better than this. By the second week, I was dodging their calls altogether. The panic had set in. The money was drying up, and they were scrambling. The reality of their situation was hitting them, and they didn't like it. I smiled to myself. This was only the beginning. I knew my parents were bad with money, but I had never realized just how reckless they had been until I started paying attention. They had refinanced the house multiple times, each time sinking deeper into debt while pretending everything was fine. I had covered so many of their expenses over the years that I never questioned how dire their situation had become. Now, without my financial support, their entire foundation was crumbling beneath them, and they were running out of time. When I first cut them off, I suspected things would unravel quickly, but I didn't expect it to be this easy. The mortgage was months behind, foreclosure was imminent, and the bank was more than happy to offload the property to a serious buyer before things got any messier. They had no idea that the buyer was me. I wasn't going to make the mistake of doing this under my name. If they found out, they would try to guilt trip, manipulate, or even outright demand that I hand everything back to them. So I set up a shell company, something completely separate, something that couldn't be traced back to me without digging through layers of legal paperwork they would never understand. I hired a lawyer to handle the purchase, and within days, the house that my parents had called home for over 20 years legally belonged to me. They had no idea. I let it sit for a few days, letting them go about their daily lives completely unaware that the ground was shifting beneath them. Then I had my lawyer draft a formal letter, a cold, impersonal notice informing them that the house had been purchased by a new owner and that, effective immediately, the property was under new management. Given the current market rates and necessary maintenance costs, the monthly rent was being increased significantly. If they failed to comply with the new payment terms, they they would be subject to eviction proceedings. The letter was sent through a third-party agency, ensuring that nothing led back to me. I waited, knowing exactly how this would play out. The first voicemail came from my mother, her voice high-pitched and shaking as she begged me to fix this, convinced there had been some terrible mistake. My father's call came next, his tone filled with barely contained rage as he demanded answers, insisting that they had rights, that nobody could just take their home away from them. Emily and Justin both called as well, though I had no idea what they thought I could do. The messages kept pouring in, texts full of confusion and desperation, slowly morphing into pure fury. They were finally feeling what it was like to be helpless, to have everything they relied on suddenly ripped away without warning, just as they had done to me for years. I never called back. I never answered a single text. I imagined them sitting at the kitchen table, clutching the letter, their faces pale as they realized they weren't homeowners anymore. They were tenants. And if they couldn't afford the rent, they wouldn't be tenants for long. They had two choices. Either they paid up and rented the home they once owned, or they packed up and left. Either way, they were never living comfortably off my money again. That night, I blocked all their numbers. I felt nothing but relief. When my mother invited me to dinner, I knew exactly what it was about. There was no sudden rekindling of motherly affection, no genuine desire to see me. This was about the house, about the letter they had received, about the cold realization that they were no longer in control. I accepted the invitation, but this time, I wasn't walking in alone. Nick came with me, not just as support, but as a witness. I wanted him to see the final act of this play, the moment my family would come to terms with the consequences of their actions. The moment I stepped inside, the tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. My parents were seated at the dining table, their expressions carefully composed, but the nervous energy in my mother's fidgeting hands and my father's clenched jaw betrayed them. Emily sat with her arms crossed, her face twisted in barely concealed irritation, while Justin refused to look up from his phone. Dinner was already served, but no one was eating. I took my seat, and Nick followed, resting his arm casually on the back of my chair. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then my father exhaled sharply and leaned forward, his hands clasped together as if trying to appear reasonable. "We need to talk about the house," he said. I didn't react. I simply picked up my glass of water and took a slow sip, waiting. "It's about the new owner," my mother chimed in, her voice softer, almost pleading. "Whoever they are, they raised the rent to a ridiculous amount. We can't afford it. We have nowhere else to go." I tilted my head slightly, as if considering their words. "That's unfortunate," I said, "but I'm sure the new owner has their reasons." Emily let out an exaggerated scoff, finally breaking her silence. "Oh, cut the act. We know you're involved in this somehow. You think you're so smart, don't you?" Nick chuckled beside me, but I didn't take my eyes off my sister. Smart enough to see what was happening. Smart enough to stop letting you all bleed me dry. My mother reached across the table, her hand trembling slightly. "Lauren, honey, we're family. You can't do this to us." I set my glass down carefully, leveling her with a look that was colder than I had ever allowed myself to give her. "Family," I repeated, my voice calm, controlled. "You called me stupid behind my back. You laughed about how easy it was to take my money. You lied to my face while spending what I gave you on vacations instead of necessities." Silence stretched across the room like a vice, squeezing the air out of their lungs. My mother's eyes widened, a flicker of realization dawning in them as she scrambled to regain control. "We didn't mean it like that," she started, her voice barely above a whisper. "But you did," I interrupted smoothly. "And now, from this moment forward, I'm no longer your daughter. I'm your landlord." The words hit the table like a sledgehammer. My father's face turned red, his fists clenching as if he wanted to slam them onto the table. "You little..." "Careful," Nick cut in, his voice low and even. "You're speaking to the person who owns the roof over your head." My father's mouth snapped shut so fast I almost laughed. My mother's expression crumbled into something desperate, something ugly. "Lauren, please. You don't understand what you're doing." "Oh, I understand perfectly," I said, standing up and smoothing out my jacket. "I understand that for years, you saw me as nothing more than a source of income. I understand that you never valued me, only what I could provide. And now, I understand that you are nothing without me." They stared at me as if I had just struck them, and in a way, I had. Nick stood up beside me, placing a hand on my lower back as we stepped away from the table. "Enjoy your dinner," I said. "And don't forget, rent is due on the 1st. I turned and walked out of the house, leaving them sitting there, stunned and powerless. They had lost not just my money, but the control they had wielded over me for so many years. And for the first time in my life, I walked away feeling nothing but free. The feeling of freedom didn't hit me all at once. It came in small moments, The quiet peace of waking up in my own home, the absence of constant demands for money, the realization that I no longer had to justify my success to people who had never truly valued me. After that final dinner, I never looked back. I moved into my new home, a space that was entirely mine, free of obligations, free of manipulation. Every morning, I woke up without the weight of someone else's problems pressing down on me. I poured my energy into my business, watching it grow stronger now that I wasn't funneling my profits into a bottomless pit of family debt. Nick was there through it all, steady and supportive, never once asking for anything except to see me happy. He had been right from the beginning. My family had been using me, and now that I had cut them off, I finally had the chance to live for myself. As for my family, they paid the rent. They had no other choice. The house they had taken for granted was no longer theirs, and the new landlord had no patience for late payments or excuses. They tried reaching out a few times, at first with anger, then with guilt, and finally with pathetic attempts at reconciliation, but I never responded. Their words no longer had power over me. I had spent years believing that being a good daughter, a good sister, meant sacrificing myself for them. But now, I understood the truth. Family is not an obligation. It is a choice, and I was choosing myself. For the first time in my life, I was free, and I would never let anyone take that away from me again. I thought I had seen the worst of my family's entitlement, but they had one final, desperate move left. When the official court notice arrived, I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. My parents, the same people who had drained me financially for years, were now suing me. The lawsuit was built on two outrageous claims. The first was an accusation of non-payment of rent, in which they claimed that the new landlord had violated an alleged verbal agreement for a grace period on payments. They insisted that since they had lived in the house for decades, they were entitled to more leniency. The second claim was even more infuriating. They were demanding compensation for parenting, arguing that they had spent over $250,000 on me throughout my life, covering food, clothing, education, and housing. In their twisted logic, I owed them reimbursement because they believed they were directly responsible for my success. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the legal documents, feeling a mix of disbelief and anger. Nick, who had been watching me from across the room, leaned forward and grabbed the papers, his expression darkening as he scanned through them. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head before muttering, "They actually think you owe them for raising you?" I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms tightly. Apparently, being their daughter was an investment, not a relationship. The more I read through their claims, the more disgusted I became. They weren't even pretending anymore. They had always seen me as nothing more than a financial asset, and now that I had taken control, they were scrambling to find a legal way to force my hand. At first, I considered ignoring the lawsuit entirely, thinking that no judge in their right mind would take it seriously. But then I made the mistake of looking online. The case had already spread across social media, and local news stations had picked it up, dubbing it the trial against your own child. The internet was ruthless. People tore my parents apart, unable to believe that they were suing their own daughter over basic parental responsibilities. Comments flooded in from every direction. How can you hate your own child so much that you demand money for raising her? Did they really expect her to finance them for the rest of their lives? It looks like they raised her as an investment, not as a person. But despite the public backlash, the court did not dismiss the case outright. The judge agreed to hear it, stating that if my parents could prove there was an agreement on preferential rent or a financial entitlement to my income, there could be a legal argument to consider. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. This wasn't just some ridiculous tantrum. This was an actual legal battle, and if I wasn't careful, I could end up legally bound to support them. My parents were willing to take this as far as it could go, and I knew one thing for sure. I would fight them with everything I had. The courtroom was filled with an uncomfortable tension as the hearing began. My parents sat at their table, my mother clutching a tissue in her hands while my father stared straight ahead, his expression stiff with forced dignity. Across from them, I sat with my lawyer, my hands resting calmly in my lap, refusing to let them see even a flicker of doubt. My parents spoke first, launching into their performance with well-rehearsed lines, their voices filled with carefully measured sorrow and outrage. "We have worked our whole lives to give Lauren a decent life, and she refuses to help us when we need it most," my mother said, her voice quivering just enough to sound pitiful without seeming theatrical. "We raised her in love and care, gave her a roof over her head, and now she wants us to pay rent for the very house she grew up in." My father, ever the serious figure, added with a solemn nod, "We are not asking for much, just fair compensation for all the years we invested in her. She became successful because of the foundation we gave her, and now she wants to turn her back on us." I sat still, unmoved, letting their words echo around the courtroom. They spoke as though they had sacrificed everything for me, as though they had struggled and toiled out of pure love, and now I was some ungrateful child who had abandoned them in their hour of need. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up and met their eyes with a calm expression. I love my parents, I began, my voice steady. But this lawsuit proves that I was never their daughter in their eyes. I was their purse. No normal parent demands financial compensation for raising their child. My mother shifted uncomfortably, her fingers tightening around the tissue in her hands. My father's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. As for the lease, I continued, they signed a legal contract. If they failed to read it or chose to ignore the terms, that is not my fault. Every condition was clearly stated, and they agreed to it willingly. They were not tricked, nor were they forced into anything. I paused for a moment before delivering the final blow. As for the argument that they raised me and therefore deserve compensation, I would like to remind the court that I started working at 18 and have been financially supporting my family for the past 10 years. If we are going to discuss debts and obligations, then perhaps we should take a closer look at who truly owes whom. That was the moment my lawyer stood and calmly placed a thick folder of documents in front of the judge. Your Honor, she said, her voice firm but measured. We have gathered extensive financial records detailing all of my client's contributions to her family over the past decade. These include direct payments for home repairs, utility bills, loan payments, as well as covering the personal debts of both her siblings and her parents. The total amount Lauren has given to her family is not hypothetical. It is documented. And that total exceeds $350,000. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. The judge flipped through the documents, his expression neutral but focused. The reality of the numbers spoke for themselves. Every single transaction was there, clear and undeniable. The payments had been made regularly, month after month, year after year, without complaint or expectation of repayment. The air shifted as the truth sank in. If we are discussing compensation for investments, my lawyer continued, then perhaps we should ask, who truly owes whom? I turned my gaze back to my parents, watching as the color drained from my mother's face. My father's hands clenched into fists on the table, his mouth pressed into a thin, furious line. They had not expected this. They had not imagined that I had kept records, that every dollar they had taken had been tracked and logged. They had come to this courtroom believing they could paint themselves as victims, but now, with the weight of their own actions laid bare for everyone to see, they were the ones who looked like frauds. And for the first time in my life, they had nothing left to say. The courtroom was silent as the judge reviewed the evidence one final time, his expression unreadable. My parents sat stiffly at their table, my mother clutching her tissue so tightly that it was beginning to tear, while my father's jaw was locked in quiet frustration. Finally, the judge set the documents down, exhaled slowly, and looked directly at them. This court finds no legal basis for the plaintiff's claim that their daughter owes them compensation for her upbringing. Parenting is a responsibility, not a financial contract. The claim for reimbursement of child-rearing costs is dismissed. I felt a wave of relief, but I kept my expression neutral. My parents, however, shifted uncomfortably, as if still hoping to salvage something from this mess. As for the lease, the judge continued, the contract is legally valid. The plaintiffs signed it willingly, and there is no evidence of coercion or misrepresentation. Therefore, they are obligated to pay the agreed-upon rent or vacate the premises in accordance with the law. A murmur swept through the courtroom, but it was nothing compared to what came next. The judge leaned slightly forward, his eyes narrowing as he addressed my parents directly. Furthermore, after reviewing the financial records provided by the defendant, this court finds that not only has Lauren provided more financial support to her parents than they have ever provided to her, but the amount significantly exceeds what they claim to have invested in her. Since there is a clear precedent for seeking financial reimbursement in this case, the court orders the plaintiffs to compensate their daughter in the amount of $100,000 for the money she has irretrievably spent on them. The room exploded into shocked whispers. I sat still, watching my parents as the reality of the ruling hit them. My mother's mouth fell open slightly, her face draining of color. My father gripped the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. This had not been the outcome they had anticipated. They had walked into this courtroom believing they would manipulate the legal system just as easily as they had manipulated me for years. They thought they could force me to continue financing their lives. Instead, they had not only lost the case, but they had legally been declared indebted to me. My father opened his mouth, desperate to argue, but the judge simply raised his hand, silencing him before he could even begin. I think you have said enough, the judge said firmly. You should be grateful that your daughter helped you at all. For a long moment, my parents just sat there, staring at the judge in disbelief. Then, as if reality had finally sunk in, my mother let out a choked sob, and my father grabbed her arm, yanking her to her feet. Without another word, they turned and stormed out of the courtroom, my mother's cries echoing down the hall as they disappeared through the doors. I exhaled slowly and allowed myself a small, satisfied smile. For the first time in my life, justice had finally been served. Nick squeezed my hand as we stood up, and I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. This battle was over, and I had won. Not just in the courtroom, but in my life. They had tried to break me, but all they had done was set me free. What do you think? Would you have done the same in my place? Do you believe parents are ever entitled to financial compensation from their children, or were they completely out of line? Let me know your thoughts. I'd love to hear what you think.